Hello everyone. In the beginning of June, Russian invaders killed Roman Ratushny, a 24-year-old Ukrainian civic activist who volunteered to defend his motherland from the genocidal attack of Putin's Russia. When he was 16, he took part in the Euromaidan protests that resulted in the Maidan Revolution in 2014. After the revolution, Roman engaged in a wide range of social initiatives and became one of the best-known anti-corruption activists in Ukraine. Like many of them, he understood very well that however democratic Ukraine was after the revolution, corruption prevented the country from realizing its true potential, or at the very least hampered that process. He might also understand that corruption was one of the main reasons why neither the Ukrainian army nor the country's security services were able to offer any meaningful resistance to the Russian occupation of Crimea in February-March 2014. Corruption is like rust, and this metaphor goes beyond the tendency of rust to spread. Like rust, corruption erodes whatever surface it comes in contact with. It degrades that surface, and if the surface is part of an object's function, corruption undermines that function. Under the pro-Russian leadership, corruption had degraded the Ukrainian army to such an extent that it could not operate as Ukraine's shield when the time of need came. It turned out that the shield had been eaten away with rust. Roman Ratushny and many other Ukrainian anti-corruption activists understood well enough that defense of democracy required a sturdy and durable armor, a strong and potent army, efficient security services, powerful intelligence and counterintelligence. Having Putin's Russia as its neighbor, Ukraine simply cannot afford being corrupt. The Kremlin is perfectly aware of this. Russian agents in Ukraine have been doing everything in their power to obstruct and slow down anti-corruption reforms in Ukraine. And at the very same time, Putin and his tools have regularly used the narrative on allegedly corrupt Ukraine in order to discredit the country in the eyes of the West. This manipulative tactic has not been limited to corruption. Russian agents would spray paint Nazi symbols across Ukrainian cities just to accuse Ukrainians of neo-Nazism afterwards. And again, nothing new here. KGB agents and their Stasi counterparts did the very same thing in West Germany in the 1950s. But back to corruption. With Ukraine, we are talking about corruption posing a threat to democracy. But what about corruption in authoritarian regimes, and especially aggressive authoritarian regimes? Unfortunately, many international institutions and anti-corruption watchdogs have been for a very long time misinterpreting corruption. For example, for the World Bank, corruption is the abuse of public office for private gain. Transparency International defines corruption as the abuse of entrusted power for private gain, adding that corruption undermines democracy. As they refer to public office or entrusted power, both definitions imply, if not the good nature of those in power, then at the very least their obligation to act for the good of the country and the people they govern. In this context, corruption is seen as something intrinsically bad because it undermines the function of authorities to do good. But as I said earlier, corruption is like rust, as it erodes any surface it touches, good or bad or whatever. It is natural to condemn corruption when it corrodes democracy's shields. But what about swords of authoritarianism or totalitarianism? What if we are dealing with criminal authorities that repress societies, communities, minorities? What if we are dealing with genocidal regimes? In these cases, corruption degrades the efficiency of these regimes and their repressive and genocidal practices. Corruption blunts the swords of authoritarian and totalitarian domination. We should welcome it. This rethinking of corruption is especially pressing today, during the ongoing Russian genocidal invasion of Ukraine. What do we think of Russian officers giving away information on deployment of Russian troops in exchange for money? Or of Russian soldiers tearing down military equipment in need of repair and swapping parts for vodka? Or of senior Russian officers selling their soldiers' provisions and significantly complicating their advance? These are real stories of corruption in the Russian army, and we need more of them. I've been studying Russian political warfare against the West for several years, and at some point I realized that corruption in Russia played a crucial role in making the Kremlin's political war less efficient. Let me give you a little example. Almost all Russian malign influence operations involve a hierarchy of people, starting from those who commission a particular operation and provide funding for it. Then you have contact people, whose job is to find contractors, and then you have foot soldiers, who actually carry out an assignment. And at every stage of moving money from the commissioner to frontline workers, resources are being misappropriated, and the workers receive too little to work well. It is because of corruption in Russia that many malign influence operations, not all of them, but many, turned out to be incredibly weak and fail. Some observers, even in Ukraine, say that Russian corruption was one of the main reasons why Russia started the war against Ukraine. This is a misconception. Corruption exists all over the world. In some countries there is even more corruption than in Russia. But why was it Putin's Russia that started a genocidal invasion of its neighbor? Or was it because of corruption in the Soviet Union that Stalin started the Holodomor, the genocidal famine in Ukraine that killed millions in the beginning of the 1930s? No, it was never about corruption. It was about the nature of the regime. I myself misinterpreted in the past Putin's regime as corrupt. Identifying it as such means that he is somehow abusing power entrusted to him. But he is not. The destruction of democracy, the severe poverty of the population, the intellectual and moral degeneration of the so-called elites, the vicious inhumanity of the repressive apparatus, these are not defects of Putin's Russia, they are the very essence of it. And the power that Putin has was never entrusted to him. He seized it through terror, lies and fraud. Putin's regime is illegitimate. It is effectively a terrorist organization that uses the language of political and state institutions to veil its criminal nature. And when the Putin regime kills, tortures and plunders, it is not abusing power, it is exercising it. The misconception of the Putin regime led some people to believe, mistakenly, that it was important to fight corruption in Putin's Russia. The idea was that fighting and disclosing corruption would somehow make the Putin regime more democratic and socially responsible. This, of course, is laughable. Putin's Russia is irredeemable, and as long as the terrorists control the state, it cannot be made more humane or socially responsible. It's simply not in its nature. But also remember, corruption is like rust. And fighting corruption in Putin's Russia is like trying to remove rust from the sword to make it sharper and deadlier. Fighting corruption in Putin's Russia is the same as conducting an audit to make it more efficient. But this is the last thing that we need. On the contrary, we need more, not less, corruption in Putin's Russia in order to undermine its function of a killing machine. Where we should fight Russian corruption, and fight resolutely and aggressively, is outside of Russia, where the Putin regime uses it as part of its political warfare against the West. And all those Russian anti-corruption activists who do want change in their country should radically readjust their agenda. We should not support their fight against corruption that blunts the sword of the genocidal Kremlin power. The West should not make the mistake of the 90s, when many believed that the embrace of capitalism by the post-Soviet Russian elites would lead them to build a democracy. Democracy should come first, everything else comes second. But we should definitely welcome any contribution to the fight against Russian corruption in the West and elsewhere, where it aims to erode the liberal order. This we should never tolerate.